My name is Sean Casey, and I'm the director of the Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs here at Georgetown University. And it's my pleasure to welcome all of you to our event tonight, The Only Way Out is Through Jesus. This event is co-sponsored by three different entities: the Berkley Center, the Pulitzer Center for Crisis Reporting, and the Georgetown Prisons and Justice Initiative. And you're going to hear more about all of these entities in coming minutes. Our event tonight features a conversation between journalist and Pulitzer grantee Danny Gold and our own Mark Howard, director of Georgetown's Prisons and Justice Initiative. And in a moment, Ann Peters from the Pulitzer Center is going to come up and introduce them and say a few words. Tonight's event marks the beginning of the second year of our partnership between the Berkley Center and the Pulitzer Center. And as a member of their consortium, we sponsor events like tonight's, where journalists who are Pulitzer grantees come and share their professional work with us. And under the guidance of the Pulitzer staff, one Georgetown student wins a Student International Reporting Fellowship every summer. And this partnership between the Berkley Center and Pulitzer is an example of the type of creative collaborations that we work to become known for, and which we hope will continue to expand in the future. So again, thank you for coming tonight. I mean, this is an absolutely fascinating topic, and obviously we've got a full house, so there's a lot of interest here. I've long been struck by a marvelous quotation from Joseph Pulitzer III that graces the Pulitzer Center's website, where he's quoted as saying, "We will illuminate dark places and with a deep sense of responsibility interpret these troubled times." Now, I don't know the date. In fact, it's kind of a timeless quote, but I think there's a deep congruence between that sentiment and our own mission at the Berkley Center, which reads, "The Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs seeks a more just and peaceful world by deepening knowledge and solving problems at the intersection of religion and global affairs through research, teaching, and engaging multiple publics." We are honored by your presence tonight. We're grateful that Danny Gold and Mark Howard have come and have traveled to be with us. Let me take a second to introduce Ann Peters to you, and then it's my job to disappear. I should also add, despite rumors to the contrary, we will not be live tweeting the World Series game. So for those of you who are Red Sox fans and Dodgers fans, starting about 8:09, I think, you're going to have to consult your private devices to get updates. We will not provide that information to you. Ann is the Director of University and Community Outreach at the Pulitzer Center. And she wears a lot of interesting hats. She's an attorney, she's a journalist, she's been a human rights advocate, and she's also a fantastic partner with the Berkley Center. We've enjoyed our first trip around the calendar together in this collaboration, and now we're into our second year. She organizes all kinds of community and other special events for the Pulitzer Center, and it's an honor for us to have you tonight, and we really do appreciate the collaboration. So again, thank you all, and I'll turn it over to you now, Ann.
Good evening. Thank you, Sean, and thanks to the entire Berkley Center team here, and of course to the Georgetown community. Among my hats, as Sean pointed out, I went to Georgetown Law, but we were on the other side of town, so it's always a pleasure to come over here to main campus. And the Pulitzer Center is 12 years old, or a little over 12 years, and we started out with the idea that international reporting needed to be provided to diverse audiences here in the U.S., more international reporting, and really digging in under the headlines. So while we might report on Sudan or El Salvador or any number of places around the world, to really allow the journalists to go in and spend time in these countries and in these regions and bring that information back to U.S. audiences that may not be hearing these reporting. And to get it out on a wide range of platforms, everything from Vox and BuzzFeed to the New York Times and The Economist and everywhere in between. But we quickly realized that education was a part of our mission. So we began working with universities, working with 2-year colleges, 4-year colleges, working with, we say K through 12 as well, but it's mainly middle and high school, although we have had some younger partners as well. So that's the Pulitzer Center. And then we got to know Sean a couple of years back, and we're very pleased that we could more formally partner here at Georgetown when he came to the Berkley Center. As Sean pointed out, we've now had our first Georgetown student who's an international reporting fellow, Julia Friedman, who reported from Columbia on the role of faith in peace and reconciliation in that country. This weekend, we're very happy to be welcoming 41 of our 42 fellows who are members at our Campus Consortium partners, coming this weekend to present their work to other fellows, to faculty, and we'll also have live streams so the public and others who could not come to our events can listen in. And Julia's presentation is this Friday, and that live stream link will be both on the Pulitzer Center website and I believe on the Berkley Center website. Just a shout out to other students and faculty here in the audience. If you or your students are interested in the 2019 Student Fellowship opportunity, please look at the Berkley Center website. All undergraduate and graduate students here at Georgetown are welcome to apply, and the application, mark your calendars, is due on January 15th. One last note for your social calendar is that please pencil in the second weekend in June 8th and 9th. The Pulitzer Center is holding its annual conference here in DC, where we focus on a particular topic area, and this year will be a focus on religion, public policy, and related issues, and more on that to come. So now turning to this evening's program, I'd like to introduce our two speakers. Danny Gold is a freelance correspondent, producer, and writer who covers crime, conflict, and politics. In 2015, he created an hour-long documentary examining the gang and police wars in El Salvador and the fallout among civilians. He has received support from the Pulitzer Center for his reporting project, The Only Way Out in El Salvador, which he will be speaking about this evening. And that reporting includes an examination of how evangelical churches have helped gang members in El Salvador escape by becoming born-again Christians. Mark Howard is a professor of government and law at Georgetown University, as well as we heard from Sean, the founding director of the Prisons and Justice Initiative, which brings together scholars and practitioners and students to combat the problem of mass incarceration. His research addresses the deep challenges of contemporary democracy and the tragedy of criminal justice in prisons in America. So please welcome Danny Gold and Mark Howard.
I don't care. Here?
Sure. All right, thank you very much, Ann and Sean. On behalf of the Prisons and Justice Initiative, let me also thank the Pulitzer Center and the Berkley Center for co-sponsoring this event and for including us in it. At the Prisons and Justice Initiative, we host a lot of events and are an academic center on campus, and hopefully many of you are familiar with our events and our work. But also, importantly, we run a lot of programs, both in carceral facilities and for formerly incarcerated people. And I think it's quite fitting to start this conversation by telling you where Danny and I just came from, which was the DC jail, where we spent several hours. No, we didn't run into a problem earlier today or anything, but it was planned, and it was part of our lecture series, which is one of the courses that Georgetown offers at the DC jail. We offer 2 credit-bearing courses now as of this semester, and we offer 8 non-credit courses, including a speaker series. And Danny was just the featured speaker. And I think, quite frankly, the experience was very profound for both of us. And I think that will filter into the conversation we're going to have. In other words, we'll have a different conversation right now than we would have if we'd had this event at 2 p.m. Before going in.
Yeah, definitely.
So let me start, Danny, just by giving you an opportunity maybe to talk about your work more generally, your work as a journalist, particularly now using film quite a bit, and then we'll hone in on the El Salvador product, which is absolutely fascinating and which also connects with the prison experience we just had.
Yeah, sure. First off, I want to thank Ann and the Pulitzer Center, who without them, this project never would have happened. And I know because I've been pitching it for about a year and couldn't get the funds to do it. And luckily, they came through and delivered, and I was able to do this wonderful project. Mustafa Khalili at The Guardian, who saw it through there, and then Neil Brandvold, who is credited as the cameraman, but he was more than that. He was essentially my fixer. He knew the project very well. He'd been in El Salvador for 2 years. He had a ton of connections, and he's just a wonderful journalist whose work you guys should all follow. Yeah, I guess I got started in journalism as a print reporter. I had tried to make a documentary about African refugees in Israel. This is years and years ago. I didn't really know what I was doing. And I had taken a month-long class in shooting and editing. The documentary didn't go anywhere, even though I thought it was good. But I didn't know how to maneuver myself in the industry. So I went to grad school at CUNY. I got out. I started covering your run-of-the-mill daily New York stories, first for the New York Post, then for the Wall Street Journal. Tackling, if a murder happened, I'd go knock on doors. If there was a press conference, I need to go ask a question, I'd go there. If a restaurant served someone a meal with a finger in it, I had to go knock on their door. Your daily reporting, which was wonderful, really enjoyable. And in New York, you sort of learn how to talk to different communities very, very quickly there. Because in one you're in a Nepalese neighborhood. Nepalese? You're in a Salvadoran neighborhood one day. You're in a Colombian neighborhood the next day. You're in a Senegalese neighborhood the next day. So it really helps you land on your feet when you're put in strange situations like I was in El Salvador a lot. And from there, I started doing my own self-funded international reporting, really focusing on Kurdish issues in Iraq and Syria and Turkey, doing stories for NBCnews.com, some stuff for Vice, Esquire, Vocative, places like that. From there, I got a fellowship to do reporting in Burma on the Rohingya. That was from the ICFJ, which is another fantastic organization that was able to fund my work. And from there, I went to Vice News. When it was just launching, I was there for about 3 years. And I switched there from print to video, doing correspondent and production work, again, focusing on the Middle East, Sub-Saharan Africa, Central African Republic. I covered Ebola in Liberia, Guinea, and Sierra Leone, the elections in Burundi, and some drug war stuff in Latin America, Costa Rica, El Salvador, a documentary I did there in 2015, and Trinidad as well. And bouncing around the States, covering things here, really focusing on conflict, crime, elements of politics, and things like that. I even covered some Trump rallies in 2016, which were, an exciting place to be. And after I parted ways with Vice. I've been freelancing since then. I covered Mosul, the operation there, because I spent a lot of time in Iraq and I wanted to be there for that. Did some work on some Netflix documentaries. Let me think. Al Jazeera, PBS NewsHour I've been working for. I actually had a piece air on PBS NewsHour last week about the migrant situation in southern Mexico and the dangers that Central Americans face fleeing their countries as they start their journey to America. And I should have a piece up on El Salvador in a few days. That was from a trip in August. This trip was in May. And this project really galvanized around a documentary I did in 2015, which El Salvador was seeing a record high murder rate during that time. I think it was up around 103 or 108 murders per 100,000 people, which usually number one for a peacetime country is around 60. So this was extraordinary. Three factions of gangs were at war with each other. They were at war with the police. The situation was extremely chaotic. And I was drawn to it for a number of reasons, not least of all, which was the role the U.S. has played in sort of fomenting the growth of these gangs inadvertently. First, in siding with the governments in the Civil War, the right-wing government there that destabilized the country even further and was extremely brutal. Refugees from there fled to Los Angeles in the 80s. And from those refugees, the gangs had already existed to a degree, but they were very low level and more just petty criminals. They were fed by the refugees from the Civil War. They expanded. They learned how to interact in Los Angeles, which was really gang-plagued in that time. And then a change in U.S. law saw a lot of these gang members deported to El Salvador in the 90s, a country that was reeling from Civil War, had no institutions to really fight against this sort of thing, and didn't know what to do. And from there, the gangs just grew. So that, and also it was just a fascinating story. Who isn't fascinated by MS-13 and 18th Street? And I wanted to know what was going on. So I did an hour-long documentary there. While I was there, we were in a jail, and there were 3 holding cells. There was an MS-13 holding cell, there was an 18th Street holding cell, and there was a holding cell for common criminals and for mixed members of those gangs. And I was kind of shocked by this because they're not typically friendly towards each other. So a jail guard explained to me that these guys were retired. They had become evangelical Christians, and the gangs allowed them to leave if that happens, so they can interact with each other. It's a completely different situation. And that was the spark that really took my interest. And for a few years, I wanted to follow up on this. I started pitching in 2017 and was not able to sell the story. No one was really interested. And then Trump started talking about MS-13. And I still was pitching the story as gangs of El Salvador, Christianity, all that. No attention. Then I put MS-13 in the subject header for the emails I would send, and then I got a lot of attention. And then luckily I had the Pulitzer Center come through with financing for this, because it's generally extremely hard to get money for international reporting these days as a freelancer, unless there's a really specific American angle. And in this, there really wasn't. I wanted to focus on El Salvador and the people of El Salvador and not have to relate it to America in this, because it shouldn't have to be related. It should be important enough as it is. And that's how I made this film.
Yeah, so we'll get into the
Sorry,
details
I went
of it.
really far ahead.
No, but that's great. That's great.
Okay.
You sort of took away my second and third question already, but that's
sorry
fine.
about
But let me just make an observation, if you haven't noticed already, and given all the places, the conflict zones, the sort of magneticism he has towards finding troubled spots and getting there the next day, Danny, and I could tell this already in the jail when he was there, and I've been with many other people who get really nervous and are uncomfortable. He is lacking what many people call the fear gene. I can tell this guy isn't afraid of anything.
I do have fear about, I'm scared of roller coasters, spiders,
Come on, 5-year-olds can
IKEA.
do that stuff. And
I'm scared of those
IKEA.
things.
I'm scared of building IKEA.
Yeah, that too.
But anyway, clearly you seek out painful stories, sorrow. I've seen some of your work and the emotions you draw out of people. You have a gift for bringing out these stories. And I saw it today with people who are incarcerated, each one of whom has an unbelievable story, and many of them are already starting to open up to you. What in particular, aside from the fact that El Salvador was a fascinating country with a history of conflict, aside from the fact that there were these gang situations that you kind of learned about it sounds like you almost fell into it in a sense. Talk to us about how you kind of drew yourself further and further into this project and leading up to the incredible revelation of sorts, and maybe that really is the right word, about the role of religion in transforming this gang culture and these gang identities for really hundreds, if not thousands, actually, of individuals, because it's pretty remarkable. So talk us through that adventure.
Yeah, I mean, I started looking into it. I had a friend, a well-known photographer, Victor Blue, who had spent a lot of time in Guatemala and El Salvador as well, and he was telling me, I had done my research on El Salvador. I knew about Archbishop Romero, who was a Catholic priest there, whose assassination essentially kicked off the Civil War, and he was preaching about liberation theology, which is the sort of theology that, and I'm no expert in this. I'm sure there's plenty of people who are. So if you want to jump in and correct me at any time, feel free. We're at a religion center, which sort of preached this fight against oppression through the religion. Standing up against your oppressors, whether it be political or economical, anything like that. And he preached this, and this is at a time in El Salvador where you had a right-wing government that wanted to scare people away from leftist movements. And liberation theology and leftist movements tying together very well. So once I started learning this history, and then how evangelicalism grew because the governments and the sort of right-wing oligarchs promoted it, you had U.S. evangelicals going down there. There were even unsubstantiated rumors of the CIA being involved because they were luring people away from Catholicism, from liberation theology. Knowing all this history, adding to that the gang situation there, which is like endlessly fascinating and endlessly misunderstood and miscontextualized in the U.S., and it really just propelled me forward in all this. And then issues of redemption are just fascinating to me. Can these guys actually be redeemed? And I do believe in redemption. I do believe in that being capable, but it's hard. Some of these guys have done really brutal, awful things. And I was palling around with them in the beginning. I don't know what they've done. Then you learn what they've done. And you ask yourself a lot of questions about what you really feel and what you believe and who's capable of this. At the same time, I'm also asking these questions as an outsider. I'm not the person who's had to live under these gangs in El Salvador for decades. I haven't lost loved ones to them. So is it for me to say that redemption is possible with them, that they should be forgiven? So I had all those questions going around in my head. And then the last thing that really sold me was that I heard from someone who had reported on this, I think Neil might have told me this, that the gangs themselves, when they allow these people to leave, they keep a really watchful eye on them. If they see them out at a bar, hitting on a woman who's not their wife, if they see them getting drunk, there are serious repercussions from that. So the idea of a person in this situation, maybe he gets out of prison, he's done his time there, he's converted, and now he's got to really stay on the straight and narrow, because if he doesn't, he can be killed. Yeah. And it's a fascinating phenomenon, and to really envision what these people are going through, even if they really believe in what they're doing, and I think a lot of them do, but I'm phrasing that the wrong way. Even if they're super dedicated to what they're doing, if they slip up, and all of us slip up, that can be dealt with extremely harshly.
Right,
So
right.
all that bouncing around, it was a story that I felt compelled to do.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's extraordinary when you think about people being brought in, often at a young age, into a gang that is extraordinarily violent and that is for life. There is no exit. Yet at some point, right, and it happens ironically in prison typically, that there is this way out through religion. Now, of course, that opens the question, is it instrumental? Is it believed? And it seems like it perhaps could be some of both. Certainly there are many for whom it's 100% genuine, and it is a real inner full transformation. But then, as you're saying, there are others where they're maybe just watching their behavior, that they don't get caught, or that they are not seen somehow acting inauthentically. But I wonder if you could kind of go deeper into that religion question.
Yeah.
Based on what you were able to see, based on the reporting you did.
I mean, it's tough to gauge, right? A lot of these guys convert in prison, where they're given better treatment if they convert, and there are less temptations. When you get out, there are more temptations. So even if they believe, you can falter. I mean, like I said, we all falter. In El Salvador too, a lot of these gangs have weird occult stuff. It started out because MS-13 actually started as like a bunch of like headbangers who were into like heavy metal and were like petty delinquents in Los Angeles. And they sort of stuck with that devil stuff. And you see, they throw up the devil sign. A lot of these guys have tattoos of devil's heads and
on
weird,
their faces. And
yeah, on their
right?
faces,
Yeah. Weird
weird Illuminati stuff. And usually you hear about people talking about, oh, the devil possessed me to do it. But here, some of the stuff they do, it's not like they have rituals, but it can really seem like, a lot of the times it has to do with addiction and drugs and alcohol. But like these guys talk about the devil like it's a real thing that took control of them. So that really lends itself to evangelical Christianity as a way of fighting that and fighting back against it. And they really believe that they're in a battle between God and Jesus and the devil. Yeah. And they have to choose a side. And it's like you said, they get sucked into this. I mean, a lot of these guys join at 10, 11, 12 years old. I'm not making excuses for their actions. Right. I would never do that. I'm not qualifying that in any way. But a lot of them have no opportunities. They all have a very similar story. I've interviewed dozens of them. Broken families or absent parents who are alcoholics or drug addicts, poverty-stricken neighborhoods, no way out, no money. They get approached at 8 or 9. Some of them are already addicts by that age. They're brought in by 2 guys who tell them, like, look, we're going to take care of you. We're your brothers now. We're your family. You're going to have respect. You're going to have money. And they just sign up, and that's it. And there's a website, Inside Crime, that does amazing work on crime in Latin America. And they did a big paper. Stephen Dudley, who's one of the originators of that website, did a big paper on the gangs and why the church makes a lot of sense for them to get out. He actually wrote an op-ed in the New York Times about it, which you should all look up. And he talks about how the church actually provides a hierarchy too, that a structure, a hierarchy, a brotherhood that these guys are all looking for. You meet some of them and you genuinely feel it. Some of them just like wanted a hug or like a pat on the back or someone to be there for them. So that transition from the gang to the church, it ends up making a lot of sense.
Yeah. And now we learned a couple interesting parallel stories today at the DC jail. One of them was striking is that apparently what you're describing in El Salvador with 18th Street and MS-13, finding religion as a way out of a gang, is actually not uncommon in multiple gangs in American prisons, where Bloods, Crips, Aryan Nation, all kinds of different gangs that thrive in many American prisons, and many people join them as a means of survival. Maybe it was even before going in, or maybe it's in prison. But a religious conversion is a credible way out to be safe. And sometimes education is, and I'm proud and happy to say that I've seen some people who were former gang members who join our programs and whose lives are transformed permanently for the better by it, and the gangs actually allow them to leave. So in a way, there's an education and religion parallel as well. But I thought that was quite striking. The other one was one of the incarcerated men, his last name is Martinez, and understands the Hispanic culture in prisons, said that 18th Street and MS-13 are actually friends in American prisons and cellmates. And so that's a complete throwing upside down of the entire conflict itself in El Salvador. And particularly since it originated in the United States, it's bizarre that there'd be perhaps some reconciliation at the place of origin. Of course, it's wreaked havoc and continues to in El Salvador itself. So maybe speak about these two parallels that we just discovered.
Yeah, I mean, I'll answer the second one first.
Yeah.
I think that's easier for me. Yeah, I mean, I was kind of fascinated by that. I think I can see the reasons. You know, these gangs started at first to protect Salvadoran immigrants from Black and Mexican gangs that were powerful in LA that they had no protection against. So I guess it kind of makes sense that in American jails where there are tons of other gangs, not just the two of them, that they would team up in some sort of way or protect each other. But it's also like people think that there's one command structure in El Salvador that dictates everything in the US what to do. And you get that a lot in American cable news, and it's not the case at all. I mean, there's a structure there. It's loose. It's anarchic. The gangs in El Salvador they've tried to organize the gangs in the US, but it's almost like they're semi-related. You know, they're not taking orders from there about like how to carry out things. And some of the gangs in El Salvador have been like, guys, calm down in the US because you're attracting attention that we don't want. So it's interesting. Also, the thing about the gangs in the US is they're not a threat to most of us. They're not a threat to John and Mrs. Smith in Iowa. They're a threat nearly completely only to Salvadoran immigrant communities in the US. So the idea that they're this like giant entity terrorizing the US is completely absurd. As is the idea that they're like a cartel or like Hezbollah. They were just classified as some sort of like organized crime group like Hezbollah and cartels, and these people aren't making a ton of money. The majority of them are living hand to mouth. There are some high-level guys that maybe have a couple $1 million, but like they're nowhere near the level of organization of the cartels. They are extremely brutal. Like, I'm not going to try to classify them as anything else, but I forgot where I was going with this. Anyway, segueing to the question about was religion and
how other gangs.
No, it was fascinating.
Gang members can leave their gangs through religion.
It was fascinating to learn that. And I think you see it too. I know that Islam in American prison systems has been a way out for a lot of gang members, which itself has, the way they practice it has a very rigid discipline and a hierarchical structure. So it's actually interesting to see that, and I think it does provide a lot of things that gang members are looking for when they join gangs. You know, respect, companionship in a way, brotherhood. A system to live by. But it's interesting because I've done a lot of work on jihadi groups in Syria and Iraq and Turkey, and you have an almost reverse situation. We didn't talk about this at all, but you have a reverse situation there. A lot of the guys who went and joined groups like ISIS and Jabhat al-Nusra in Syria that were from the West were guys who were, you know, like your normal criminal, right? Guys who drug dealers, serial domestic abusers, murderers, assault, like people in normal street gangs there, they became very religious in prison, or there was some sort of intervention where they became very religious, and they look at the brand of Islam that ISIS bastardizes and calls their religion as a way out, you know, of the sins that they've done. It absolves them when they go over there and they commit these crimes in the name of ISIS. So it's a weird way of looking at it, but it's also interesting too because the way people join these gangs is the same thing as the way they join these jihadi groups is very similar to the way that any gang really functions, right? Broken families, lack of opportunities, people who reach out that can bring you into this thing that gives you respect and toughness and a structure to move forward.
Yeah. So let me ask maybe one more question before we open it up to the audience. If you were to have the opportunity to go do a follow-up, a second piece, a related piece, if Pulitzer Center offered you, they loved your work so much and this event so much that you had the opportunity to do something that were, you know, on this theme, but the next step, whether that would be applications to the use of MS-13 as sort of a label in the United States and American politics, which has, of course, become very prominent and, as you say, misleading, misunderstood. Or perhaps back to the original sources and follow-ups on how people have adapted over time, whether they've stayed true outwardly and inwardly to their new faith. Where would you conceivably go next with this product? It sounds like you've broken some new ground. I think it's an extraordinary revelation. I think it's very profound. But what would you want to know more? There's always a potential
No, for sure.
sequel or
I mean, my colleague Neil on this project has been following one guy for about a year. He hasn't cut the footage yet, but I think he's going to have a very special project when he's done. We had a lot of stuff here that we had to cut out involving someone who lost a parent to one of the gangs and whether she was capable of forgiveness with the police and how they view them. I'd love to go back and do a bigger project including some of that stuff, not just following up with these guys and seeing how they're doing since they've been doing this or finding, there's other pastors that we weren't able to work with. So I'd love to look into that. I'd love to look into some of the historical elements that I talked about in the 70s and 80s and how that's led to what's happening right now, especially involving Catholicism and evangelical Christianity. And I'd love to, do stuff with the police and with victims and really look at them and whether they're capable of forgiveness, whether they think these people are capable of redemption, because I think that is like the central question in this, right?
Yeah. And what do you think the answer is?
A victim I spoke to said yeah. Like she was like my grandmother, she lost her mother. Her grandmother was like, if people like that came to my house and asked for food, I would forgive them. She thinks it's capable. She thinks her country's not capable of forgiveness. The police, no. They're like, look, these guys are gang members. Maybe they convert. Maybe they convert in prison, but they get out. They want easy money. Like they're going to go back right to it.
I see.
So there's a lack of forgiveness there. And I think with the population in El Salvador too, I can't attest to this as a fact, but I would assume that most of them aren't willing to forgive. Because you have, the more stringent the government is in dealing with these groups, the harder they go after them, the more votes they get.
I see.
Even if it's extrajudicial killings and things like that, it's got popular support.
But is it a lack of forgiveness or is it a lack of belief in their sincerity?
That's true, because that's about the gangs themselves.
In other words, if they were to be convinced that it's sincere, that is a full religious conversion, both in terms of their beliefs and their behavior, and that it were permanent, would they then forgive?
That's a really good question.
Or is it impossible?
I don't know.
Which is, and frankly, either, I can't put myself in those shoes, but I could see how either side would be legitimate.
No, but you're right, though, because it's two questions, right? Is one, do they actually believe that they've converted? And two, do they forgive them even if they do believe they've converted?
Exactly.
So that'd be another interesting thing. There we go.
Part 2
make
and
some
3.
calls, ready to go.
Yeah. Well, you've brought up so many interesting topics, both about the nuts and bolts of the project itself and then the larger ramifications. I want to give members of the audience a chance to pose some questions. Yes, sir.
In your depiction of what's happening in El Salvador, do you distinguish between evangelicals and Pentecostals? And then my second question is, if you're familiar with the city transformation movement, is it groups of churches in a city or community allying together for prayer meetings, spiritual warfare, or is it more of a Lone Ranger evangelicals, like a Nicky Cruz and the Cross and the Switchblade kind of story?
Those are good questions. No, the first one, I didn't. I was told they were evangelicals, and I sort of went with that, and I didn't probe deeper. But now that you mentioned it, I'd like to learn more. And there are some groups that there are some Catholic churches that work with former prisoners. But yeah, I don't know the distinction, and I probably should figure that out. And yeah, it does seem like Lone Ranger churches. There are some. In some of these barrios, there's dozens of churches, and some of those guys work together and know each other. Not all of them work with the gangs. It takes a very specific type of pastor to do that, because you've got to be very, very careful, right? They have to maintain respect with the active gang members, who they also can't get too close to, and they've got to be able to win over the members that are trying to convert and are trying to live on the straight and narrow. But they also, some of these pastors get targeted too by the police for being too close to the gangs. But for the most part, it's individual. And there's dozens of churches in these neighborhoods. Some Some of them, I think, work together, but for the most part, it's very individual.
Yeah,
Oh, sorry.
sure. Yeah.
Yeah, just as an offshoot from that, what do you see as some of the differences between the capabilities of some of these evangelical movements versus the Catholic Church, and what might interest some of these gang members in what the evangelical movements have to offer versus the structure and the marble majesty of the Catholic Church, or did you not really see a big difference there?
I didn't dive too much into that either, but I think that evangelical groups, they're much more active in trying to proselytize in those neighborhoods, and they're much more willing to work with gang members, I think, than the Catholic Church. And also, evangelicalism in El Salvador is on the rise. I think in the early 80s, it was something around 17% of the population. Now it's said to be up near 40%. Wow. So this is a religion that's growing very, very fast in El Salvador. And they're making serious efforts. And now, I mean, I was told this is something that I haven't verified, but a young woman in El Salvador told me that now evangelicalism is seen as a religion of the poor. Catholicism is seen as a religion of the elite, which I thought was very fascinating. And again, I would double check that information and verify it because I have yet to do that. But I thought that was pretty interesting.
Yeah, right behind you.
Hi, I'm Cynthia, and I'm a Georgetown Law grad too, so thanks so much for coming.
Thank you for having me.
Do you know about the Homeboys ministry working with gangs in LA?
In Los Angeles?
Yeah, Greg Boyle.
Yeah, I've heard a bit
Jesuit.
about them. And there was a Homies Unidos, right? That was a thing in El Salvador.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then my question was, in the DC jails, do you know which churches around this area, either Pentecostal or Evangelical, may be working with gang members in the DC jails?
That's a question for Mark.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think that all religions are represented in jails and prisons. I don't know if there's one that's sort of cornered the market, so to speak, and is particularly active with gang members. There's always a greater proportion of Muslim incarcerated people who've converted often to Islam. But I'm not sure about the DC jail in particular. It doesn't strike me as having a very different mix from other prisons and jails that I've been to. And it doesn't strike me as being more or less religious. It's certainly, for many people, religious activities are the one type of activity that they're entitled to. There's a freedom of religion and a freedom to practice your religion that is paramount in jails and prisons. There aren't very many others, including freedom to books, what we would think is basic things, freedom of speech, freedom to be heard, and so on. So much is restricted. So people, when they're incarcerated, are really in the dark and lost and forgotten to society. But religion is the one element where they have that right. Now, it may not be so wonderful, it may not be the best services. Usually every prison has one chapel that's multi-denominational and so on. But fortunately, there are many outside visitors who come to support those of their faith, of all faiths. And so they're able to practice. But it's one of the few rights that they have. And I think perhaps for that reason, there might be more people who become religious or who at least attend religious services because it's one of the only things that they can do. And I mean that literally. Other than sit in cells, maybe lift weights, very few reading materials. The DC jail is a lot better than most places, I have to say, and we have a great partnership with them that's been forming and growing. But in general, I just want people to know, especially if they don't think about prisons very much, that they're some of the most barren, desolate, dehumanizing places on earth, particularly American prisons, which are some of the worst.
Yeah, it was very upsetting. These guys that we talked to were great. They were interested. They were asking me really great questions. They were fact-checking me about certain things. They were
and they have
terrific.
no internet either. So
yeah, and they were enthusiastic, but I wanted to email with them, and they don't have access to email in the DC jail.
Or any prison in America. Some federal prisons have something called core links, very expensive and monitored.
It's
sort
absurd.
of a racket. But they're really cut off from the world. Yeah. Okay. There's another hand here, and then we'll kind of come back over. A lot of hands in the air. So bear with us. Be patient.
Thank you. I'm really glad the Berkley Center is hosting this event. I'm glad that the Pulitzer Foundation has funded you, Danny. Because you really have a good breadth of experience. So first of all, I'm wondering, are there any particular characteristics of converts to evangelical Christianity compared to, well, those that you saw, I guess, in the Middle East, in the jails there, who converted to Islam or became more fervent in Islam? The other thing is, that I guess, I'm not sure, I'm biased because I'm mostly here in the US, but evangelicalism is associated with the United States in comparison to Catholicism, which of course most people would think of Rome. So is there any association in terms of in El Salvador? Do people associate evangelicalism with the United States? And then what's like the perception? Is it a helpful one in terms of any linkages to the United States? Is it helpful, or actually does it hurt the ministry of those who are going to the prisons, as evangelicals to minister to them? Thank you.
Those are great questions. The first one, I haven't spent much time. I don't think I've interviewed any foreign jihadis in Syria. These are all just things I've gathered from other reports and from being in the region. But I mean, characteristics, I don't know. From that process, I feel like it's, from what I've heard and what I've read about that, it seems like a much slower process. Evangelical converts that I met, they had similar patterns, but all of them seemed to have a big aha moment when they felt like someone was speaking to them. And a lot of them have to do with like life-threatening situations. The main guy in the film had tuberculosis, and when he survived that, thought he was dying, and then he converted and he lived. Others, situations where they survived, they thought they were going to be killed, or they thought they were just like left alone, and they had some sort of, vision or moment that really spoke to them. It's interesting. They all follow similar patterns in life. Young age, broken family, addiction, gang, prison, awakening moment, getting out and trying to lead a better life, and they all follow that sort of guideline. So, yeah, I don't have the exact answer for that, but it's something that I should definitely look into more. And then associations with the U.S. I know that, again, this is something I'd love to explore more. That in the 80s, a lot of evangelical groups in the U.S. were very active in proselytizing inside El Salvador. I don't know if it's directly associated with the U.S. in El Salvador. If it was, it wouldn't hurt it. El Salvadorans feel very connected to the U.S. A lot of them have family members here. They have a lot of love for the U.S. too. Like the people who believe in the American dream the most are in El Salvador right now, way more than people in America. They're by far, they would be, if they were allowed to come here, they would be by far the most patriotic Americans like we've had. So yeah, I don't know. I actually don't know. It's interesting though. They do have similarities with American evangelicals, especially when it comes to, foreign relations, like in countries with. There's a lot of support among evangelical churches in El Salvador for Israel. Like you go into these neighborhoods there because they believe in a sort of rapture that's coming. So I think the Salvadoran governments, maybe it's Salvador and El Salvador and Guatemala, were okay with the embassy move, like the only countries besides the U.S. But fact check me on that. I know one of them, maybe two. Guatemala. El Salvador too, or no? But it's interesting to see that situation there. So I think they have a lot of elements of U.S. evangelicalism. I don't know if it's exactly associated with the U.S.
Yes.
Yeah, I just was going to mention a couple things. We talk about the growth of evangelicalism. One of the largest denominations around the world is Assemblies of God. That's evangelical, and so in Central America, it's huge. And you have that history with people like Marcus Witt, who, on a drop of a dime, 40,000, 50,000 people will show up in a conference center. So there's been a movement along that path. The challenge, I think, is that many of our Hispanic churches, both here and in Central America, don't have a theology for social justice as the Catholic Church has had. And so I think that's in process. And to me, it's remarkable that the impact that those evangelical churches are having, in spite of the fact there's just a few of them. And so I think that it'll be interesting to see in the future if that grows. I was going to ask about, on the prison side, Prison Fellowship in the last 10 years has had some extensive research in their work in prisons, and I'm wondering what your thoughts are about that, and have you seen that, those results be realized in the work that you do?
Do you want me to go first?
Yeah.
So, Prison Fellowship, which has been around for a while, has really expanded over the past decade. Basically, it was founded by Chuck Colson, who himself had been in prison due to the Nixon-Watergate investigation, and through that experience had a religious conversion himself, but also an experience of prison and the tremendous level of good that exists within people who may have done something bad. And one of the things that organization has done is has sought to bring about religious conversion and to support people along that path and to support people after prison as well. So it's an extraordinary organization, has tremendous breadth. It has a lot of support, financial support, moral support, and I think there are incredible success stories that it's brought about. And I think one of the things that's very important, not only has it helped the lives of many people along a path of, you might say, personal redemption, but it's also helped to change the entire narrative nationally about incarceration, about, one, it's brought a spotlight in terms of the conditions that we put people in, that we inflict upon people that are truly horrific. Two, it helps to humanize them, to show the good in them, and then to support them afterwards, which is something people sometimes forget, which is 95% of people who are incarcerated are coming home. And rather than put them in cages and, proverbially poke them in the eye for years and years, why not lend them a helping hand? Why not show them a better way? Why not to support them when they get out? Because we'll all be safer and better as a society if we do so. So Prison Fellowship has played a very important role in changing the narrative about incarceration, showing the humanity in people, that one that's gone, frankly, hand in hand with other types of organizations that cross the political spectrum. So it tends to be identified as a more evangelical, right-of-center organization, but it's not all that different from Black Lives Matter or from ACLU or from even Koch brothers in Georgia. I mean, there's been this bringing together of different points of view, and Prison Fellowship has played a very important role in that. I think it's undeniable, and it's also helped a lot of people in their individual journeys. We're kind of going to this side, and then we'll move over to this kind of, because you've been neglected on this side.
Thank you. I've done a lot of work in Central America, and I'm also a graduate of the Georgetown Law Center. And I've done work around juvenile justice systems, so I've interviewed lots of former gang members as well. And I've worked with them. And one of the key issues that you learn when you talk to them is this lack of social belonging, no? It's a social belonging. We talk a lot here in America. I'm originally from Argentina, but I've been living here many years now. But we talk a lot about diversity and inclusion, but we don't talk about belonging. And when you talk to former gang members, you understand why they join. No, it's this lack of social belonging. Or many of the drivers that you mentioned. No, and I think that is a very important element of that. And you talked. I haven't seen your documentary, so I have to watch it now. I'm motivated to do that now. But not that long ago, I was reading an article about a former Nazi capo, living in Auschwitz, and he was talking. The person that wrote the article talked about him finding redemption through confession with a Catholic priest that they somehow were able to find along the way, and he, before dying, being hanged, he somehow was able to find redemption. So I wonder how your work has linked this issue of, because you were a bit skeptical about finding redemption. And in a way, we all have that right, no matter, I believe it's a right. No, but linked also to this idea of social belonging, because the reality that people face in conflict-affected societies is very difficult, no? So I wonder whether you were able to sort of look at some of these issues through your work. It's
No,
a
it's-
complex,
Yeah.
very complex questions, no? But questions that I struggled with a lot as part of my work.
No, it's one of those things that that is in the center of my mind a lot recently, and it always has been with my work. Like, who is capable of forgiveness? How do we define redemption? And I don't have a clear answer. My mind changes all the time, right? Like, you could hear some of the stuff these guys would do. In Ebenezer Church, I was there quite a few times, and you go and you meet these guys, and they're lovely, and you're joking around, and you're comparing tattoos, and you're like, oh, these guys are great, And then you find out some of the stuff they've done, and it's hard to reconcile with everything, right? Who is capable of this? Who isn't? Even like look at our society right now. Like, I don't know. The guy, the NFL player, just got out of jail, 19 years.
Ray Caruth.
Yeah, had his wife, pregnant girlfriend or pregnant wife killed. Served 19 years. Can I forgive that guy? That's a horrible crime. Do I forgive? He served his time. He served 19. 19 years is a long time. Is he capable of redemption? Even, oh God, do we want to go down that path?
Oh, don't
let
tell
me
me you're going
think.
to say OJ.
What's that?
No.
No, I was going to say stuff like the Me Too stuff, right? A lot of that stuff is extremely horrible. Are those guys eventually going to be capable of redemption 10 years from now? And what do we define as redemption? Is it going back to your old life? Do you have to make some sort of appeasement to the people that you wronged? How do we judge whether you're contrite or not? And it's like a human nature question, right? And I'm a sucker. Like, if I get to know somebody and they're great, I'm like, all right, yeah, this guy's good to go. But then if I read the stuff on paper, maybe I have a different feeling. It's really, really hard to gauge. And you do have some people that are probably, I don't think a lot of people are fully, sociopathic or evil, but I'm sure there are people out there that are like that are very charming, that you'd want to forgive right away when you meet them. But yeah, the guys we met today, some of them have served 20 years for murders they committed when they're 17, when they were 17 years old. How do you not offer these people redemption? Yeah, it's one of those things I would love to explore for a very long project, but it's also one of those things that I don't think I'll ever have an answer for, right? But it's a great question.
Yeah, we'll go to this side of the aisle.
Sorry, I perhaps I'm just going back to the same question
No,
because
please
I
do.
think it's in the essence of your work. I think perhaps what my predecessors have said is sort of like in the center of your work. It's whether the Catholic Church has had a lot of work with gang members in El Salvador and in Central America, and trying to offer them some sort of like an option, and from a sociological, from a sort of like social justice perspective within an organized church that is the Catholic Church. But it seems like the evangelical churches have been much more successful in offering them redemption and forgiveness, so that going back to my colleague from Argentina, saying that offers them some sort of like belonging, so that they could just be, forgiven, so that they can go back to society. And I'm very familiar with the work that Father Gregory is doing in southern LA. So I wonder, whether this is a fad, whether this sort of like intervention of the evangelical churches is sort of like something like at some point the Catholic Church did, the truth. I'm not sure whether you're familiar with the truth in El Salvador that was brokered.
The truce, yes, in 2012.
Yeah, by the Catholic Church.
Yeah, and Raul
So
Mohengo
for a while, it just
Yeah.
when the killing went down. So for a while, the Catholic Church was successful at that. So are we just seeing another religious fad? And I wonder. I say it with sadness because I think we ought to find a much more permanent way. And if it's religion, let's welcome it. But I wonder whether that's the way.
I don't know. You know, I think that a lot of these communities are evangelical to start with, and maybe that's why the gangs are able to work with them. You know, the evangelical pastors who work with the gang members will say, we're the only ones crazy enough to do it, right? That's their excuse. You know, the truce itself was actually, I guess for the gang members, they were okay with it, but a lot of the people in society are very skeptical of the results that it had. They think that it conferred a legitimacy on the gangs they didn't have, that the murders only went down as the gangs stocked up on arms and extortion attempts and were able to spread. So there's mixed opinions on that. And one of the guys who just, who negotiated, a civilian, Raul Mahenga, who negotiated the truce, was just sentenced to 13 years, I believe. But yeah, so I don't know whether that had an effect either. I don't know why the Catholic Church hasn't been successful. I think it might relate to the fact that evangelical Christianity is just on the rise in El Salvador in general. So of course, you know, and especially in these neighborhoods. So of course the gangs are going to be more attracted to those pastors. But I don't, you know, I'm also not an expert on religion, like even remotely. And I'm sure people here could definitely correct a lot of the assumptions or the statements I've said. So I don't know what it is about the values in them that really do contribute to this, whether it is that fundamentally different.
But isn't there possibly a sociological explanation? I feel like when we were on our driving from the DC jail to here, stuck in traffic, you were alluding to this kind of the first one, the first, or at least big one, gang member who kind of led the way and then became a minister. Yeah. And that may have then opened the door to others who saw that he had done it. And so it happened to be evangelical, yeah. But if it had been something else, maybe others would have followed. Because basically, I think many people who are in gangs are trapped. They desperately want to get out. They desperately don't want to commit the acts that the gang is forcing them to do. They probably, the majority would probably just drop it if they could. But they're stuck with it, but they saw an out because of this precedent that might not even be because of the actual content of the religion, but just the avenue that was opened sociologically by a person who set a precedent and others followed it. Is that possible?
Well, he was the first one in the church I worked in, and he brought in others. And I think it started in Gotera, I believe, which is an 18th Street prison. So I'm sure, like these guys, some of the early guys brought in others. I don't know. I'm not familiar with the conversion process for Catholicism. Is it a lengthy process? Is it like Judaism, or is it very short? Does anyone? There's a class? Because I know with evangelicalism, from what I observed, it was very quick. So maybe that has something. I mean, they try to convert me half the time.
A minute or two. Dunk your head.
No, so I think that might be it. And the symbolism of the baptism, like in that way, of this pastor like cleansing you in a way, that might be it as well. I mean, like Judaism's like a 6-month process. Like who's going to sign up for that? I'm Jewish too. I can make those jokes. So just so we're clear. Right. But yeah, I don't know.
Sean?
So Danny, I mean, this is so fascinating. And one of the things I'm curious about is why is it that gang leaders would say, oh yeah, you can go through that door and it's cool with us. Right. And that seems to be a given, a constant here. And is that something about the continued salience of Catholicism in the culture? But like, why is that a route that everybody agrees to is, yeah, okay, if you walk that route, if you go the Jesus route, then you're cool, we're not going to harass you. Or kill you. And so that's what's fascinating to me. That's constant across the whole discussion. I'm just curious if you had a chance to interact with current gang leaders as, well, why is it that's the one route that everybody here says, okay, we're going to leave you alone because you took the Jesus route out?
It's a great question. I had a chance to interact with them in 2015, but not on my recent trips. And it's hard because they kind of just, some of the people, like the converted gang members are like, yeah, you know, the church has just always been there, right? The churches are the active ones in these communities. They're the only ones who are allowed to do a lot of stuff. If you want to go in as an NGO, you can't go in unless the church gives you permission. Any sort of services the churches provide, and they're staples of the community. So I don't know what came first, right? It's really hard to parse, and I never got a straight answer. I think maybe some of it does go back to the fact that, and it's Catholicism too, which is the other weird thing, because Archbishop Romero was such a hero to the Salvadoran people, and was a really heroic guy when you look back on the stuff he did and what he stood for, and he really was like the voice of the poor, the voice of the oppressed there. And he is, he is someone who everyone in that country that I've spoken to, at least, really has a lot of love for. Maybe it relates to that, but then you would assume it would be Catholicism. So I don't know. The church just has always had this relation with where they've been able to get away with this stuff. But it's not easy. They still the gang leaders aren't happy when this happens. They're not thrilled with it. But also, you look at other churches, I feel like, I know in Italy with the mafia, hasn't the church always been off limits in terms of like, going after and things like that? It seems like religious houses of worship in general, in certain places where there are conflicts like this, have been respected in a way that not a lot of other organizations have. But it's a good question. I don't have a straight answer for it either.
Oh,
Hi, so
yeah.
I'm actually. Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I was calling him. Go ahead. Yeah.
Okay.
Please.
Hi, so I'm actually Salvadoran myself, and I grew up in El Salvador during some time like post-Civil War. And one of the main stories you would hear, and especially being a young girl at the time, was kind of like during the Civil War, a lot of murders with women, and how that was like a really big deal. My mom would tell stories about having to hide during the war because of, women were a really big target. And I was recently reading the spike in murders of women by gang violence, and just with a lot of close community ties back home, I have friends and family members who literally can't go to church, they can't go to school because they have to stay inside as being young women. There's a lot of fear around that. And so I was very curious to know about how gender played out in your work and how you saw, especially with a lot of gang members also being women themselves and being kind of forced into these groups, how that played out, and how was there a difference between, that conversion aspect, and just wondering to see if that was in your work.
Yeah, I did. There were some female gang members in some of these churches. I didn't get to spend too much time with them, but I think it's definitely a thing for women as well. But also, El Salvador still has big issues with women's rights, and you could track some of that to, I think, some of the strict Catholicism and evangelicalism that's in the country, especially with the abortion stuff right now, which is awful. But no, again, it's not a subject that I was able to explore really thoroughly. But I know it's definitely on the table because I was at a church in a neighborhood where there was a woman who was preaching, and she was a former gang member who she had essentially lost, I think, a supply of drugs and converted right after that, and somehow was able to do that. And she was a very dedicated preacher, and I didn't get to spend too much time with her, but it's happening there. I think the majority of gang members are men there, but they do bring the women in. And it's really scary for a lot of these young women in these neighborhoods because if they date a gang member, they can't, it's an awful situation. But no, again, that's another story that maybe you should pitch to the Bolger Center. I'm just saying, if you're a student.
There was a hand right behind you.
Hi.
Hi.
This question is also about fear, I guess. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering what you can tell us about the attitudes that either the members of community or law enforcement had towards the youth that would be perceived to be the prime categories for recruitment. I think specifically of street kids, or you mentioned there are some specific sort of characteristics that most gang members possess. Is there like a preemptive hostility, or have there been targeted efforts on the part of community members and the church to intervene and support kids and give them that sense of belonging that the gangs?
From the church or from the police towards these kids?
Well, I guess there's a two-part question.
Right.
Is there preemptive hostility, or is there preemptive support? Which one weighs out more? And then both from the community perspective, are folks from the community hostile towards street kids who might end up in a gang? Are the police, the law enforcement hostile towards those youth?
The church is active in trying to intercede with these kids when they can. We went around with William Arias. No, actually not with Arias. He wasn't there. With a pastor who was not a gang member, but works a lot of gang members, and introduced me to Arias. So he went around preaching in his neighborhood, which is Distrito Italia, which is a very tough neighborhood, tough MS-13 neighborhood. And he was trying to get a 9-year-old kid to convert on the spot. The kid wasn't having it, but he was also just like, this is the age I have to reach them at. Because if I don't reach them now, like that's recruitment age. So there are serious efforts made by these guys to get these kids in, you know? From police, there's huge issues with the police treatment of young people in gang neighborhoods now. Everyone is assumed to be a gang member. Everyone's assumed to be affiliated. And the former gang members will talk about how like people view their neighborhoods as trash. The people there as trash. They look down on them. It's a huge issue, but especially with law enforcement now. I mean, there's the UN issued proclamations about extrajudicial killings in El Salvador. I think in 2016 there were something like close to 600 gang members that were killed or alleged gang members. Anyone in a poor neighborhood who's a young man who's like probably 13, 14 to like 22 is going to be assumed to be affiliated in some way.
Take one more question from the audience, and then we're unfortunately out of time. I'm going to use my prerogative to ask a very final question.
Oh, God.
Or, okay, how about we just take a couple in a row, and then you'll answer them. And
Speed round?
Yeah.
Okay.
At least they're two right next to each other.
Yeah.
So with the U.S. having a lot of intervention in different forms in El Salvador, when I know we're trying to keep the U.S. out of it, but how does Trump's latest comments on the migrant caravan coming to the United States affect the situation there, because he's calling them criminals? And how do we combat that misperception?
How does it affect the situation there?
Wait, we'll group a couple.
I gotta remember them all,
So I'm also from El Salvador. I grew up there and I was there until the age of 9. And my family's also evangelical. So actually 3 weeks ago, I went back home in Northern Virginia, and the pastor that was preaching that day was actually a former gang member. That's actually how they marketed the event, like former gang member, now pastor. And I was fascinated by like all the things that he spoke about that really impacted him about the faith, particularly the idea of freedom, because he became a convert while still in jail, and he remained there for 5 more years. But he was like, I was there, but I was free. So I was gonna ask, like, what theological truth do you think impacts the most? Is it the idea of being forgiven? Is it the idea that perfect justice has been done at the cross, like Christ atoned and he paid for all the evil things that I did? Or is it more of like, I'm welcome into God's family? Like, what theological truth do you think really like makes their hearts like respond to this faith?
I think, you know, a bunch of the folks I spoke to was this idea that they were forgiven, that they could forgive themselves. And one of the guys called himself a recycled person, like he gets a chance to start over. Like it really struck him as the fact that God would accept him, that he would be absolved of his sins, and that for his future he would do, you know, he would remain strong in the faith and do penance for it. So that idea of being forgiven and being allowed to forgive yourself, that really struck me as something that got a hold of them. And then Trump's comments, I mean, people in El Salvador, they don't seem to live and die on the words of the president here. They're not, I doubt they're happy with the way that he's addressed it. Some of them have been like, yeah, he's right, this is a shithole, which was a little off-putting for me. I don't think they like the way they're being characterized, but they also really have a hatred for the gang. So him talking about, you know, he talks about MS-13 in the US, but his words hold relatively true for MS-13 in El Salvador. So they want tough action on the gangs too, right? So they're not entirely negative about it. I don't think they like the way they're portrayed. People were kind of aghast at the family separations, and that definitely slowed down the migration show for a bit, but since then it's picked back up. I mean, I think it's our duty as Americans to convince other Americans that like these are human beings here, and like this is what they're fleeing, and it's awful. It's hard because I don't want to classify El Salvador as like a crazy war zone. It's a, you know, there are normal things that go on in the country. You can lead a normal life there. People are wonderful. I'm greeted very warmly every time I go there. But it is an awful situation for a lot of people. And when you allow a president to really portray these people as, you know, lesser than, as people who aren't worthy of coming here, when so many of them come here and do wonderful things and are better citizens than most people born here, have less of a crime rate than people born here, it's distressing, it's bothersome. And I would ask, it's twofold, right? You've got, and it's hard because you want to convince people, one, that the people coming here are coming here for a legitimate reason. They should be allowed here. They're essentially refugees. And two, that they're wonderful people who deserve a chance. So walking that line can be tough sometimes. But I don't know if that answers your question.
Well, unfortunately, we don't have time for more questions. I'm sorry. Danny can stick around. I can stick around a little bit afterwards. I was flashed the 5-minute sign about 10 minutes ago.
It's my fault.
I will use my prerogative for one last question, bringing it back home to prisons, bringing it back to the D.C. jail where we just came from. I go to jails and prisons once or twice a week. I've been doing so for over 4 years. I probably have about 300 days in, which, could be time served for a minor felony at some point. No nights, though. But I have a bias, you might say, and a warmth and a connection with the people who are my students behind bars. But since they are separated from society, and since many people don't get that experience, although I have brought in now many hundreds of students, and I've brought in many guest speakers, and you're the latest of them, I'd just like to give you the opportunity to share your kind of hot take, so to speak, just coming out about the people you met, about the experience that you just had. And if we can close on that.
Yeah, it was powerful. I mean, you guys were terrific, but that was probably the best speaking engagement I've ever had.
This is the second best right here.
Yeah, second best.
The first best was before.
I just want to know more about everyone. I want to talk to them more. There was a breadth of knowledge there about stuff that I will never be able to understand, or facts that I couldn't get unless I was able to talk to them more. And it really hurt when they weren't, I figured out they couldn't email because I was used to core links and stuff like that. Yeah. I want to come back. And I would encourage anyone who wants to get involved with Mark's program any way they can, because it's powerful. Look, again, I'm not absolving people of their actions, but it is important to understand that people are human beings, and some of them make bad decisions because they're put in circumstances that no one should be put in. The faster you come to that conclusion, I think the better you'll have a look at what our country is doing to people like this, and how to try to work to make sure that things do get better for these people.
Yeah.
But everyone was great. I want to go back.
Okay. Well, thank you for those comments. Thank you for your remarks here. Thank you for your film, for your work that you've done, and thanks for coming to Georgetown.
Thank you for having me, and again, thanks to the Pulitzer Center, the Berkley Center, and all of you guys for coming and watching my work. I really appreciate it.